Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping into something really fascinating, a huge three-part series by Zakariya Kamal called The Scientific Tafsir of the Quran. And believe me, it's an ambitious attempt to connect the ancient world with our modern one in a way you've probably never seen before.
So here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at his whole scientific rereading of the text. Then we'll get into his cosmic model. It's pretty wild. After that, we'll see how he connects scripture, science, and the soul. We'll also touch on his blueprint for society. And finally, we'll wrap up with a big question that all of this leaves us with.
All right, first up, a scientific rereading. To really get what this whole project is about, we've got to understand the author's main goal. I mean, what's the driving force behind trying to read an ancient text through a modern scientific lens? So let's start with the basics. A tafsir is basically a scholarly commentary or interpretation of the Quran. Now, there have been tons of these over the centuries, right? You've got linguistic ones, historical ones, spiritual ones, a whole range. But what Zakariya Kamal is doing here, well, he says it's something completely different.
Okay, so what's his big idea? His whole argument is that modern science doesn't clash with the Quran. In fact, he believes it actually shines a new light on the verses, and, for him, proves it's divine. So the end game here is to build this massive, all-encompassing framework for everything. Life, the universe, the whole shebang. And it's all based only on what he sees as the scientifically provable meaning of the text, without any of the later interpretations he thinks were just added by people. All right, now we're getting into the really mind-bending stuff, the Quran's cosmic model. This is where the author's ideas take a sharp turn away from what you'd call conventional science. He's laying out this huge cosmic blueprint for all of existence, and he's pulling it all directly from his interpretation of the Quran. So you know how we usually talk about the Big Bang, right? One single event that started everything. Well, forget that for a second. The author proposes something called a cyclic universe. He's saying our universe isn't the first one. Nope, it actually bounced into existence from the collapse of a previous universe, a big crunch, as it's called. And get this, in his model, we're currently in the second of three big cosmic cycles.
And here's a perfect example of how he does it. He takes this verse, "Do not the unbelievers see that the skies and the lands were joined together before we clothed them asunder," and uses it as evidence for his big bounce theory. See that word, lands? He interprets that as pre-existing matter, like dust and asteroids, that was already there before our universe began. So for him, this suggests creation didn't come from nothing, but from the leftovers of the universe before ours.
It gets even more complex. Within this big cyclic model, he lays out a structure with multiple universes. So first, there's our physical universe, which he calls samawat. Interestingly, he says this is also where hell is located. Then you have a totally separate universe called Jannat, that's paradise. And linking the two, a third realm called Araf, which is kind of like a hub, a sanctuary for angels, and a place for communication between these different realities. You've probably heard the Quran mention the seven skies, right? Well, the author says, don't think of that as physical layers above us, like in our atmosphere. No, he interprets them as these massive structural waves in space-time itself. Picture it like the peels of an onion. In his model, these waves were the guiding force that ensured matter spread out evenly, and the galaxies formed the way they did while the universe was expanding. Okay, so he's applied this method to the biggest things imaginable, the cosmos. But he doesn't stop there. He takes the exact same approach and scales it all the way down to the very building blocks of life. He really hones in on certain phrases that pop up again and again in the scripture. Take this one, for example, the noble pair. Now, for hundreds of years, people have interpreted this in a bunch of different ways. But the author, he comes along and proposes a very specific, very modern scientific meaning for it. And here it is. This is a pretty radical take. He argues that every time the Quran mentions life being created in pairs, or zawj, it's not just a poetic phrase. He says it's a direct scientific reference to the DNA double helix. Those two twisting strands of the DNA molecule, that, in his view, is the noble pair that acts as the blueprint for every single living thing. And he keeps going with this scientific mapping idea, applying it even to something as abstract as the soul. He actually breaks it down into two parts. First, there's the ruh. He defines this as a kind of elementary soul, almost like a fundamental force field. He even compares it to a magnetic field that carries out a command. Then you have the nafs. That's the complete individual soul of a person or being, which he says comes from a part of God's own nafs.
Okay, so we've gone from the cosmic scale down to the biological. That's a huge range. But the big question is, how does this all translate into the real world? How does this framework become a blueprint for human life and society?
Well, he starts by identifying a very specific geographical area that he calls the home of Ummah, or Darussalam. And he's not vague about it. He says it's the land stretching all the way from Morocco to the Pamir Mountains in Central Asia. For him, this specific territory is the primary homeland for the Muslim community, and it's absolutely central to how he understands Islamic law. And defining this territory has some really big implications. The author argues that a whole section of the Quran, chapters 3 to 9, which he calls the Furqan, or the war book, and all the rules of warfare in it, well, they only apply inside this home of Ummah. He claims that anywhere outside this specific zone, the message is meant to be spread peacefully, by preachers and Sufis. Now, a real cornerstone of his whole social framework is this: a strict Quran-first approach. He prioritizes the Quran way above the Hadith. Those are the collected sayings and traditions of the Prophet Muhammad. And let me tell you, that's a huge break from mainstream Islamic thought. And he gives his reasons. He says the Hadith can create divisions, that it's at risk of being corrupted or lost over time, and that the Quran itself says it's a clear book, meaning it's all you need. So let's pull back and look at the big picture. What's the main takeaway here? When you step back and look at all 3 volumes of his work, from the structure of the cosmos to the laws of society, what you see is this massive effort to build one single, unified system that explains everything. It's really an attempt to connect all the dots, right? From cosmology and biology all the way to sociology. He's trying to fit it all under this one interpretive lens. His goal is to show that if you read the Quran through his scientific framework, it reveals itself as a complete, verifiable code, not just for how to live, but for the very fabric of reality itself. And all of this brings us to one final, really provocative question to think about. This entire massive project is built on one idea: finding scientific proof inside a text of faith. So it makes you wonder, what exactly is the relationship between belief and evidence? And what happens when you try to look for both of them in the exact same place?